The crimson sands of Zirian Prime shifted beneath Commander Varric Ironhold's boots as he surveyed the impossible structure rising from the desert floor, where 3 months ago there had been nothing but endless dunes and the skeletal remains of failed Rex-High mining operations. Now stood a tower that defied every law of physics the galaxy had established over millennia. Impossible, hissed General Quoth through his translator, his 6 eyes narrowing to slits as they tracked the tower's impossible geometry. The Rex-High commander's carapace gleamed like oil in the twin sun's light, but even his species' legendary composure couldn't mask the unease radiating from his pheromone glands. Humans lack the cerebral capacity for such construction. The neural pathways are too primitive, too chaotic. Varric suppressed a grin. Let the bug think what he wanted. After 18 months of being dismissed as barely sentient meat sacks by the galactic triumvirate, humanity had grown comfortable with low expectations. The Rex-High, HFY, and Zypherian alliance had made their position clear when they quarantined Earth's solar system. Humans were too violent, too unpredictable, too dangerous to be allowed into civilized space. The tower pulsed with an internal light that seemed to bend reality around its edges. Varric's enhanced optics struggled to focus on its surface, as if the structure existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The engineering reports from his reconnaissance team had been equally baffling. Materials that shouldn't exist, energy signatures that violated thermodynamics, and construction techniques that predated known civilization yet utilized technology beyond current understanding. Perhaps, Varric said, his voice carrying the weight of carefully controlled amusement. Your assessment of human capabilities requires revision. Quoth's mandibles clicked in what passed for laughter among his species. Commander Ironhold, we have monitored your species for 2 centuries. You burn your own atmosphere, wage wars over invisible lines on maps, and cannot even achieve unity among your own kind. The idea that you could construct something that challenges HFY dimensional physics is absurd. The communication array in Varric's helmet crackled to life. Commander, this is Cassius Grimm at the observatory. We're detecting massive gravitational distortions around the tower. Whatever it's doing, it's affecting local space-time in ways we've never seen. Varric's pulse quickened. Cassius was humanity's most brilliant astrophysicist, a man whose unconventional theories had been dismissed by the galactic scientific community as primitively intuitive. If Cassius was concerned, they were entering uncharted territory, defined, massive. Varric vocalized, the kind that could theoretically punch holes through dimensional barriers. Commander, if my calculations are correct, this thing isn't just a building, it's a gateway. Through his peripheral vision, Varric watched Quoth as security details spread into tactical positions. The Rex-High were many things: arrogant, rigid, supremacist, but they weren't stupid. They detected the same anomalies. General, Varric said, his tone deceptively casual. I believe we should discuss terms for humanity's admission to the triumvirate. The clicking stopped. Quoth's head swiveled toward him with mechanical precision, compound eyes glittering with a mixture of fury and calculation. Terms, you jest. Surely, your species controls one insignificant star system. We control 63 sectors of the galaxy, and yet, Varric gestured toward the tower, which now hung with increasing intensity. Here we stand. The truth was more complex than either commander acknowledged. The tower wasn't just human engineering, it was a result of 18 months of desperate collaboration between Earth's most brilliant minds, and something else, something that had been waiting in the quantum foam between dimensions, patient and ancient and absolutely inhuman. Dr. Elena Voss had made first contact through her experiments with consciousness-driven physics, and what she'd found had changed everything. The entity called itself the Architect, and it had been watching the galaxy's civilizations rise and fall for eons. It found most species predictable, their development following mathematical curves that could be plotted millennia in advance. But humans, chaotic, contradictory, impossibly stubborn humans, had caught its attention. Your species adapts, the Architect had told Elena during their first meeting in the space between thoughts. Others optimize. There's a profound difference. Now, as the tower's resonance frequency began matching the quantum signature of dimensional barriers, Varric felt the weight of humanity's gamble. They had one chance to prove they belonged among the stars, one chance to show that ingenuity born from desperation could reshape the universe itself. The first phase was about to begin. The dimensional rift tore open like a wound in reality. General Kveth's tactical display erupted in warnings as impossible. Shapes began emerging from the tower's apex, geometric forms that hurt to perceive directly, their surfaces reflecting lights that didn't exist in normal space-time. His soldiers, elite HFY shock troop who had crushed rebellions across 17 systems, stumbled backward as their visual cortexes struggled to process what they were seeing. Dimensional breach confirmed, Dr. Elena Voss's voice crackled through the comm system from her laboratory 3 kilometers underground. The architect is opening the first gateway. All personnel, implement protocol Lazarus immediately. Varric felt the familiar surge of combat stems flooding his bloodstream as his armor's medical suite responded to elevated threat levels. Around him, the carefully positioned human forces, supposedly just a diplomatic escort, shed their facade of PIAC. At full observers, weapons materialized from concealed compartments, and suddenly Kveth found himself surrounded by 60 of humanity's most lethal operators. Treachery, the HFY general hissed, his carapace shifting to a deep purple indicating extreme agitation. The triumvirate will. His words died. As the first architect construct fully materialized, the entity defied description, part crystalline mathematics, part liquid geometry, all impossible angles that folded space around themselves. When it spoke, reality rippled. The test begins. Lieutenant Nara Blackthorn, her scarred face impassive behind tactical visors, watched her motion sensors go haywire as more constructs began emerging. Each one was unique, as if the architect was experimenting with different approaches to three-dimensional existence. Some flowed like mercury given consciousness, others clicked and hummed with mechanical precision, and a few simply existed as probability clouds that occasionally collapsed into terrifying solidity. Commander, she reported, her voice steady despite the chaos erupting around them, we have 37 entities and counting. The HFY are falling back to defensive positions. Varric nodded grimly. Phase 2 was ahead of schedule. The HFY weren't retreating, they were regrouping for a devastating counterattack. Kveth's 6 eyes tracked the construct's movements with predatory focus as his tactical AI calculated firing solutions. The HFY had conquered most of the galaxy through overwhelming technological superiority, and they weren't about to let primitive humans and their impossible allies change that equation. Fire, Kveth commanded. The desert exploded in coherent energy. HFY plasma cannons, each capable of reducing a mountain to constituent atoms, carved brilliant lines through the air. The energy beams struck the nearest construct dead center and passed through it as if it were made of light. The construct turned what might have been its attention toward the HFY positions. Reality warped around it like heat shimmer, and suddenly 3 of Kveth's heavy weapons positions simply weren't, not destroyed, not vaporized, erased, as if they had never existed at all. Dimensional phasing, Elena's voice explained over the calm. Clinical despite the circumstances, they exist partially outside of reality. Conventional weapons can't touch them. Then how? Kveth began, but Varric was already moving. Raven Squad, implement consciousness protocol, he ordered. Link with the constructs. What happened next would have been impossible for any other species in the galaxy, where the HFY relied on technology and the Kethmori on perfect mathematical precision. Humans had developed something unprecedented, the ability to interface directly with consciousness-based entities through pure force of will and adaptive thinking. Sergeant Marcus Steelwind closed his eyes and reached out with his mind, feeling for the alien thought patterns Elena had taught them to recognize. The process was dangerous. 3 volunteers had suffered complete neural collapse during training, but it was humanity's only advantage in this conflict. Contact. The construct's consciousness was vast and alien, but underneath its incomprehensible geometries, Marcus found something familiar. Curiosity. The entity was as fascinated by human thought patterns as humans were terrified by its impossible existence. I see you, Marcus whispered, and suddenly he could perceive the construct's true form. Not the painful angles and warped space, but the pure mathematical beauty of a mind thinking in 11 dimensions. Around him, 5 more operators established similar connections. The constructs stopped their seemingly random movements and began coordinating with human forces. Their reality warping abilities now directed with human tactical cunning. Th watched in horror as the impossible became tactically sound. His remaining positions found themselves attacked by enemies that can step sideways through dimensions, appear behind cover, and manipulate local physics to turn his own weapons against him. In 15 minutes of combat, His elite expeditionary force had been reduced to scattered survivors hiding behind failing energy shields. But the Wreck's High General wasn't finished. His species hadn't conquered 63 sectors by giving up easily. Emergency beacon activated. He transmitted. Full fleet response authorized. Priority Alpha. High above Zirian Prime's atmosphere, space began to shimmer as the Wreck's High Third Fleet dropped out of hyperspace. 12 dreadnoughts, 46 cruisers, and over 200 support vessels, enough firepower to sterilize a planet. Varric looked up at the darkening sky and smiled. Elena, is the tower ready for Phase 3? Charging now. But Commander, if this doesn't work, then humanity goes out fighting. Varric replied, just like we always have. The tower's hum became a roar that shook the desert floor. More rifts began opening, revealing glimpses of spaces that human minds couldn't fully comprehend. And in those spaces, ancient things that had been waiting patiently for someone clever enough and desperate enough to find them began to stir. Admiral Crixnos of the Wreck's High Third Fleet had personally overseen the pacification of 47 worlds. None had prepared him for what his sensors were detecting on Zirian Prime. Report. He commanded from the bridge of his flagship. Inevitable consequence, sir. His tactical officer's translators struggled with the alien concepts. We're detecting massive temporal distortions, gravitic anomalies, and the officer paused, mandibles clicking nervously. Spatial geometries that violate the fundamental constants of physics. Through the view screen, Crixnos could see the tower, rising from the planet's surface like a needle-piercing reality itself. The structure had grown since orbital surveillance first detected it, not expanded, but somehow become more present, as if it was asserting itself into existence through sheer force of will. Sir, communications reported, we're receiving a transmission from General Kveth's position. His ground forces have suffered 87% casualties. He's requesting immediate orbital bombardment of the entire region. Crixnos' compound eyes glittered. Kveth was one of their finest tactical commanders, a veteran of the Keth-Mori border wars. If he was requesting orbital bombardment of his own position, the situation on the ground had deteriorated beyond recovery. Charge the extinction arrays, Crixnos ordered. Full planetary sterilization protocol. But before his weapons officer could comply, space around the Third Fleet began to twist. 3,000 kilometers above Zirian Prime, Dr. Elena Voss felt the architect's consciousness merge more fully with her own. The sensation was overwhelming, like trying to contain an ocean in a teacup, but she held on through sheer determination and the neural conditioning that had cost her most of her memories of life before the project. The fleet is in position, she reported to Varric, her voice distorted by the psychic stress of maintaining the connection, initiating Phase 3. The tower had never been just a structure, it was a focal point, a lens through which the architect could channel its abilities into three-dimensional space. But more than that, it was a trap. Every species in the galaxy had developed faster than light travel through the same basic principle, creating controlled tiers in space-time that allowed ships to jump between distant points. The technology was so universal that it had become as common as atmospheric flight. What no one had considered was that those tiers left scars, and those scars could be exploited. Elena felt her consciousness expand as the architect showed her the truth. Hyperspace wasn't empty, it was full of things that had been waiting, patient and hungry, for someone to show them the way back to reality. The first rift opened directly beneath the inevitable consequence. Admiral Crixnos had exactly 3 seconds to process what his sensors were telling him, before something that had been dreaming in the space between spaces reached through the tier and embraced his flagship with appendages made of crystallized time. The dreadnought, 2 kilometers of advanced Wreck's high engineering, crumpled like paper, not from physical force, but from the sudden realization that its constituent atoms had been existing at different temporal rates for the past several million years, and were just now noticing the discrepancy. Evasive maneuvers, Crixnos screamed, but his fleet was trapped in a carefully orchestrated nightmare. Commander Varric watched from the surface as reality wars erupted across Zirian Prime's sky. Each hyperspace scar that humanity had discovered and cataloged over the past 18 months became a doorway for entities that existed in the spaces between thoughts. The Wreck's High Fleet, designed to face conventional enemies with conventional physics, found itself fighting opponents that could rewrite local causality on a whim. Sir, Lieutenant Blackthorne reported, her voice tight with concentration as she maintained her link with a construct that resembled a geometric equation given murderous intent. Wreck's high casualties are at 60% and climbing, but we're losing people too. Sergeant Mills just suffered complete neural feedback. He's alive, but Varric nodded grimly. Interfacing with consciousness-based entities was burning out human operators at an alarming rate. They had perhaps 30 minutes before their remaining psychic links collapsed entirely. On the ground, General Kveth rallied his surviving forces behind the twisted wreckage of their heavy equipment. The Vrexhai were discovering that their technological superiority meant nothing when their enemies could step sideways through dimensions and attack from directions that didn't technically exist. Fall back to the extraction point, Kveth ordered, his carapace now showing the deep black of desperate fury. We'll regroup, and the construct that Sergeant Steelwind was controlling materialized directly in the center of the Vrexhai formation. Reality bent around it like gravity given visible form, and suddenly Kveth's soldiers found themselves falling upward into a sky that had become the ground. Steelwind screamed as alien mathematics flooded his consciousness. Blood ran from his eyes, but he held the link, guiding the construct through a dance of destruction that left 30 Vrexhai soldiers scattered across several dimensions simultaneously above them. The space battle had become something that violated several fundamental principles of physics. Vrexhai ships fired weapons that created brief stars, only to watch their targets step sideways into probability clouds and emerge behind them as living equations that solved themselves by consuming matter. But the aliens weren't defenseless. Admiral Crixnos had survived 47 planetary pacifications by being both ruthless and adaptable. As his remaining ships regrouped in a defensive formation, he authorized the use of weapons that the Triumvirate had banned for being too indiscriminate. Deploy the reality anchors, he commanded. Lock down local space-time and force these entities back into standard physics. The device's massive crystalline constructs that functioned as universal constants made manifest materialized around the battle zone. Suddenly, the fluid nature of reality began to solidify. The consciousness-based entities found themselves trapped in three-dimensional space, their impossible geometries constrained by the rigid laws of physics. Elena felt the architects' distress through their connection. They're forcing us into linear existence, she reported. The constructs are becoming vulnerable to conventional weapons, and indeed, Vrexhai plasma fire was now cutting through entities that moments before had been untouchable. The tide of battle was shifting, and not in humanity's favor. Varric felt the familiar calm that came with desperate circumstances. Elena, how long until Phase 4? The dimensional matrix needs another 16 minutes to fully charge. We don't have 16 minutes. Above them, space continued to burn as impossible beings fought a war that was rewriting the fundamental nature of reality itself. Below, the last remnants of human and Vrexhai forces prepared for a final confrontation that would determine whether humanity earned its place among the stars or died as a footnote in galactic history. The real battle was about to begin. Commander, Varric made the hardest decision of his military career. As Vrexhai plasma fire carved through the dimensional constructs like a scythe through wheat, the reality anchors had changed everything, forcing beings of pure consciousness into the brutal limitations of three-dimensional space, where they could bleed and die. All units, initiate Berserker Protocol, he commanded, his voice carrying across every human comm channel on Zerion Prime. We're going kinetic. Lieutenant Blackthorn felt her connection to the construct she'd been guiding dissolve, as the alien entity suffered a direct hit from a Vrexhai heavy plasma cannon. The feedback through their psychic link sent her stumbling to her knees, blood streaming from her nose, but she was already reaching for her rifle. Humanity's greatest advantage, their ability to adapt faster than any other species in the galaxy, was about to be tested to its limits. What happened next would be remembered as the moment the galaxy learned why the Triumvirate had quarantined humanity in the first place. Sergeant Marcus Steelwind, his mind still reeling from neural backlash, landed in the center of the Vrexhai formation like a falling star. His powered armor's jump jets had carried him over 100 meters in a single bound, and he hit the ground with both feet and all the fury of a species that had spent millennia perfecting the art of warfare. The Vrexhai were a proud warrior race, but they fought with discipline and technological superiority. Humans fought with a viciousness that bordered on the psychotic. Steelwind's assault rifle loaded with rounds that incorporated fragments of the same impossible materials used in the tower's construction tore through Vrek's high carapaces like they were made of cardboard. But when his ammunition ran dry, he didn't retreat to reload. He drew his combat knife and charged directly into the center of the alien formation. General Kveth watched in fascination and horror as the human sergeant became a whirlwind of calculated brutality. Each movement served multiple purposes. A strike that severed nerve clusters also positioned him for the next attack. A dodge that avoided incoming fire simultaneously lined up a killing blow on an exposed flank. The human wasn't just fighting. He was orchestrating a symphony of violence. Impossible, Kveth whispered as Steelwind took down 6 soldiers in less than 10 seconds. Their neural processing speed isn't sufficient for that level of tactical calculation, but the Vrek's High General was thinking like a computer. Humans didn't calculate their way through combat. They intuited, adapted, and improvised with a flexibility that no other species could match. Steelwind wasn't processing the battle. He was becoming a dot above them. The space battle had taken an equally savage turn. With the consciousness-based entities trapped in normal physics, the fight had devolved into the kind of brutal slugging match that humanity had been perfecting since they first picked up rocks and started hitting each other with them. Captain Reeves, commanding the human stealth destroyer Vindictive Proof, used his ship's superior maneuverability to dance between the Vrek's high dreadnoughts. Like a knife fighter in a crowd of sword masters, his weapons couldn't match their firepower. But humans had learned long ago that you didn't need to hit harder, you just needed to hit smarter. Target their reality anchors, he ordered his weapons officer. If we can't fight them in locked space-time, we'll unlock it. The Vindictive Proof's experimental railguns accelerating projectiles to significant fractions of light speed, using technology reverse-engineered from architect mathematics punched through the reality anchors. Protective fields like they were made of tissue paper. The crystalline device shattered, and immediately local space-time began to fluctuate again. Admiral Crixnos realized too late what the humans were attempting. All ships, protect the remaining anchors at any cost. But humanity's strategy wasn't just about tactics, it was about understanding their enemy's psychology. The Vrek's were conquerors, accustomed to overwhelming force and decisive victories. They weren't prepared for an enemy that treated desperate circumstances as a competitive advantage. On the surface, Dr. Elena Voss felt the dimensional matrix finally reach critical charge. The tower had absorbed enough energy from the battle, both the exotic radiation from the consciousness entities and the massive gravitational distortions from the space combat to attempt something unprecedented. Phase 4 is ready, she reported, her voice distorted by the enormous psychic strain of maintaining her connection to the architect. But Commander, this is irreversible. Once we open a permanent gateway, there's no going back. Varric looked around at the battlefield. Human forces were taking massive casualties, their reckless, aggressive tactics effective, but costly. Steelwind was down, his armor breached in 6 places, but still fighting with a pistol in one hand and a knife in the other. Lieutenant Blackthorn was coordinating artillery strikes while applying emergency medical care to wounded soldiers. Half his command was dead or dying, but they were winning. The Vrek's high formation was collapsing. General Kveth himself had taken a human rifle round through his primary thorax and was leaking ichor across the desert sand. The Third Fleet had lost 8 dreadnoughts and was retreating to the edge of the system. Most importantly, they had proven something the galaxy needed to see. Do it, Varric commanded. The tower's hum became a scream that resonated across multiple dimensions. Reality tore open like fabric, revealing spaces between spaces where things that had never been born waited with infinite patience. But this time, humanity wasn't just opening a door, they were installing themselves as the gatekeepers. Elena felt her consciousness merge completely with the architect as the permanent gateway stabilized. The sensation was overwhelming, transformative, and utterly irreversible. She was no longer entirely human, but she was still definitely human enough to smile as she felt the triumvirate's monitoring. Stations detect the massive dimensional breach. Gateway established, she reported, her voice now carrying harmonics that existed in several dimensions simultaneously. We have permanent access to transdimensional space. Admiral Crixnos watched his remaining ships flee toward the hyperspace jump point and made a decision that would reshape galactic politics. Instead of continuing the retreat, he opened a direct communication channel to the human surface forces. Commander Varric. The translation matrix rendered his clicking speech into human language. The triumvirate wishes to negotiate. Varric, his armor scarred and smoking from close-range plasma fire, looked up at the impossible tower rising from Zirian Prime's desert. Through its crystal walls, he could see glimpses of spaces where the laws of physics were more like gentle suggestions, where consciousness itself was a form of matter, and where ancient minds waited to teach newer species how to transcend the limitations of three-dimensional existence. "I'm listening," he replied. But the real negotiation was just beginning. The Kethmori war fleet materialized at the edge of Zirian Prime's system, like a swarm of geometric nightmares. Unlike the Vrek's highest brute force approach, the Kethmori fought with mathematical precision. Their ships were crystalline structures that existed in perfect harmony with the fundamental constants of the universe, each one a masterwork of physics, made manifest. Supreme Calculator Vexani studied the tactical display with her species' characteristic dispassion. The Kethmori had spent 3 million years achieving perfect unity between mathematics and reality. They found the humans' chaotic approach to physics deeply offensive, analysis complete, reported her subordinate, a geometric construct that existed primarily as living equations. The humans have corrupted local space-time with probability paradoxes. Their dimensional gateway is creating cascade failures in the quantum foam. Unacceptable, Vexani replied, her voice carrying the weight of absolute mathematical certainty. Deploy the correction fleet. This reality pollution must be contained. What emerged from hyperspace defied conventional description. The Kethmori correction fleet wasn't composed of ships in any traditional sense. They were mobile theorems, weapons that fired pure mathematical concepts, engines that propelled themselves by solving the equation of their own existence. Commander Varric watched the approaching fleet through the tower's observation crystal and felt a chill that had nothing to do with Zirian Prime's desert winds. The Vrek's High had been brutal, but comprehensible enemies. The Kethmori represented something far more dangerous, absolute order attempting to impose itself on the chaos of human ingenuity. Elena, he called to Dr. Voss, whose consciousness now existed partially in the space between dimensions. Can the gateway entities handle mathematical weapons? Her response came through speakers that resonated in frequencies human ears couldn't normally perceive. The architect says the Kethmori represent a fundamental threat to consciousness-based existence. Their mathematics are designed to reduce reality to predictable equations. If they succeed, they'll eliminate the possibility of creative thought. Throughout this sector of space, the first wave struck before humanity could fully prepare. Kethmori theorem ships didn't fire conventional weapons. They fired proofs, mathematical arguments so elegant and irrefutable that reality had no choice but to accept them as true. The first proof argued that human soldiers' molecular bonds were statistically unlikely to maintain coherence. 37. Human operators simply dissolved into their constituent atoms. Scatter. Lieutenant Blackthorne screamed, her tactical training adapting to threats that existed purely as abstract concepts. Don't let them establish logical frameworks around our positions. But the Kethmori were methodical. Their second wave fired a proof that human weapons couldn't exist, because the mathematical probability of their construction approached zero. Half of humanity's arsenal simply ceased to function, their firing mechanisms suddenly governed by equations that made shooting impossible. Captain Reeves, commanding the vindictive proof in high orbit, found his ship's weapons systems failing, as Kethmori mathematics rewrote the fundamental principles that allowed his railguns to accelerate projectiles. Engineering, what's happening to our systems? Sir, came the panicked response. Our computers are trying to solve equations that don't have solutions. The Kethmori are attacking us with paradoxes. It was Sergeant Steelwind, his armor jury-rigged with components salvaged from destroyed Vrek's High equipment, who provided humanity's first effective counterstrike. As a Kethmori theorem ship prepared to fire a proof that would reduce his squad to quantum uncertainty, he did something the mathematically perfect aliens couldn't predict. He stopped thinking logically. Instead of trying to understand the approaching mathematical weapon, Steelwind embraced pure human intuition. He fired his rifle at random, sprayed suppression rounds in patterns that made no tactical sense, and threw grenades at targets that logic dictated he couldn't possibly hit. The Kethmori theorem ship paused, its mathematical processor struggling to calculate optimal responses to actions that followed no rational pattern. In that moment of hesitation, one of Steelwind's random shots struck the ship's computational core. The theorem ship didn't explode, it became confused. Suddenly uncertain about its own mathematical foundations, it began firing proofs that contradicted each other, creating logical loops that made its weapons array collapse into recursive paradoxes. "That's it," Elena's voice echoed across all human communication channels. Her consciousness now distributed throughout the tower's dimensional matrix. "The Keth-Mori can't handle true randomness. Their mathematics require predictable inputs." Be unpredictable. What followed was the strangest battle in galactic history. Human forces abandoned traditional tactics entirely. Lieutenant Blackthorn organized her troops into patterns that shifted randomly every few seconds. Soldiers fired their weapons while spinning in circles, charged in directions that made no strategic sense, and used equipment in ways their manufacturers had never intended. The effect on the mathematically precise Keth-Mori was devastating. Their theorem ships, designed to calculate optimal responses to rational behavior, found themselves trying to solve equations with variables that changed according to no discernible pattern. Processing cores overloaded, weapon systems fired paradox, rounds that canceled themselves out. Entire sections of the correction fleet became trapped in logical loops that made them forget how to maintain their own existence. But the cost to humanity was enormous. Maintaining true randomness while fighting a war required a level of mental flexibility that pushed human consciousness to its breaking point. Soldiers began suffering neural cascade failures as their brains tried to process tactical situations that deliberately made no sense. The casualty rate soared past 60%. Dr. Marcus Chen, the expedition's chief medical officer, worked frantically to treat warriors whose minds had been shattered by their own deliberate illogic. "Commander, we can't maintain this strategy much longer. The human brain isn't designed to function in completely random patterns." Above them, the space battle had devolved into something that resembled abstract art more than military conflict. Captain Reeves had ordered his crew to input random numbers into their navigation computers, causing the vindictive proof to move through space in patterns that violated both physics and common sense. The ship's course looked like a three-dimensional representation of insanity, but it was keeping them alive as Keth-Mori targeting systems failed to predict their movements. Supreme Calculator Vexani watched her perfect fleet reduced to mathematical chaos and felt something she had never experienced in 3 million years of existence of certainty. The humans weren't just resisting the Keth-Mori's logical weapons. They were proving that logic itself might be incomplete. "This is impossible," she transmitted to her remaining forces. "Chaos cannot triumph over mathematical certainty." But from his position on Zirian Prime's surface, Commander Varric looked up at the impossible tower and realized that humanity had stumbled onto something far more significant than a new weapon. They had discovered that consciousness itself messy, unpredictable. A logical human consciousness might be the universe's answer to perfect order. The tower pulsed with new energy as the architect, working through Elena's transformed consciousness, began opening additional gateways. What emerged weren't more geometric entities, but something far stranger, pure possibility given form. Beings of living randomness that existed as crystallized chaos. The final phase of the battle was about to begin, and it would determine whether the universe belonged to mathematical perfection or beautiful, terrible, wonderful disorder. The Zypherian judgment fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the precise moment when the battle between order and chaos reached its crescendo. Their ships were works of absolute artistry, crystalline structures that sang in harmonics that could drive lesser species insane. Each vessel a perfect fusion of aesthetic beauty and destructive capability. Fleet singer melodic vortex, her consciousness, distributed across 17 different art forms simultaneously, observed the battle through sensory apparatus that interpreted reality as living symphony. What she perceived horrified her beyond her species' capacity for expression. "The humans have created discord," she harmonized to her fleet, her voice creating interference patterns in local space. "Time. They are making the universe tone-deaf." The Zypherian approach to warfare was unique among galactic civilizations. They didn't destroy enemies, they incorporated them into increasingly complex artistic compositions, turning entire star systems into vast symphonies of coordinated destruction. Their weapons fired crystallized music that could shatter planets by finding their resonant frequencies and playing them until their molecular bonds dissolved. But as they approached Zirian Prime, the Zypherian ships encountered something that challenged their fundamental understanding of reality. The humans were creating art by destroying it. Elena Voss, her consciousness now existing primarily in the spaces between dimensions, felt the architect's ancient amusement through their connection. They think in patterns, the entity explained through mathematics that bypassed language entirely. All three species Rex high brutality, Keth-Mori logic, Zypherian aesthetics, but you humans, you think in contradictions. On the planet's surface, Commander Varric coordinated humanity's most desperate gambit yet, with most of his forces dead or dying from the psychological strain of maintaining true randomness. He was preparing to do something unprecedented in galactic warfare. Surrender the initiative entirely. All units, implement Pandora Protocol, he commanded, his voice carrying across comm channels that now resonated with harmonics. From 11 different dimensions, open all channels, let them in. Lieutenant Blackthorn, her face streaked with blood from neural feedback injuries, stared at her commander in shock. Sir, Pandora Protocol means complete vulnerability. Varric finished. No shields, no defensive measures, no attempts to protect ourselves from their attacks. We're going to let them do their worst. What humanity had discovered during 18 months of desperate research was that consciousness-based entities could only be truly defeated by beings willing to experience complete annihilation. The Vrexhi fought to dominate, the Kethmori to perfect, the Zypherians to beautify, but humans alone had developed the capacity to lose everything and keep fighting. The Zypherian fleet's first harmonious assault struck human positions with the force of concentrated beauty. Their crystallized music weapons fired symphonies that should have transformed the defending soldiers into living instruments, their screams becoming part of a composition that would play for millennia. Instead, something unprecedented happened. Sergeant Steelwind, his armor cracked and his body broken from 3 battles, stood directly in the path of a Zypherian harmony beam and began singing off-key, not accidentally, deliberately. With the same focused intensity he brought to combat, Steelwind produced the most discordant, painful noise his damaged vocal cords could manage. The sound was everything the Zypherians found abhorrent, chaotic, ugly, emotionally raw, and absolutely human. The harmony beam shattered. The Zypherian weapon, designed to incorporate any sound into its perfect composition, couldn't process deliberate discord. Steelwind's singing was so magnificently awful that it created resonance cascades throughout the enemy ship's crystalline structure. Within seconds, the vessel began harmonizing with itself in destructive frequencies, tearing itself apart as it tried to find a musical pattern that could accommodate pure human stubbornness. Impossible. Fleet Singer Melodic Vortex harmonized, her voice creating visible fractures in space-time. Art cannot be destroyed by whatever that was. But across the battlefield, human soldiers were following Steelwind's example. They sang badly, played broken instruments they'd scavenged from the wreckage, and created sounds that violated every principle of musical theory. Lieutenant Blackthorn conducted an orchestra of dying soldiers, whose instruments were their own groans of pain, creating a symphony of suffering that was both heartbreaking and strategically devastating. The Zypherian fleet found itself trapped in an aesthetic nightmare. Their ships, designed to create beauty through destruction, were being forced to process input that challenged their core programming. Some vessels began playing compositions that argued with themselves. Others attempted to find harmony in chaos and overloaded their artistic matrices. But the cost to humanity was catastrophic. Pandora Protocol demanded that they absorb every attack, experience every form of destruction their enemies could devise. Human casualties climbed past 80% as Vrexhi plasma fire, Kethmori mathematical weapons, and Zypherian harmony beams struck undefended positions. Dr. Elena Voss, her consciousness now existing primarily as living mathematics, felt her connection to baseline humanity straining as the transformation accelerated. She was becoming something else, not human, not architect, but a hybrid consciousness that existed in the spaces between species. Commander, she reported, her voice now carrying undertones that human ears couldn't fully process. The tower is reaching critical resonance. The permanent gateway is destabilizing local reality across 17 dimensions. Above Zirian Prime, space itself was beginning to unravel. The combined effect of 3 different alien weapons systems, human consciousness-based entities, and the tower's dimensional manipulation was creating tears in the fabric of reality. Through the gaps, ancient things that predated the current universe began to take notice. Supreme Calculator Vexani, her mathematical perfection cracking under the strain of processing true randomness for the first time in her species' history, made a calculation that violated every principle of Kethmori logic. She began to doubt. Perhaps, she transmitted to the combined triumvirate fleet, our approach requires revision. Fleet singer melodic vortex. Her aesthetic consciousness reeling from exposure to deliberate ugliness, found herself composing something unprecedented, a song that incorporated discord as a fundamental element. The melody was painful, chaotic, and absolutely beautiful in its imperfection. They are teaching us new forms of art, she harmonized, her voice creating patterns that her species had never imagined possible. General Kveth, his carapace cracked and leaking ichor, watched human soldiers continue fighting with weapons that shouldn't work, using tactics that violated military science, and dying in ways that somehow made them stronger. His compound eyes tracked the impossible tower as it pulsed with energies that rewrote local physics. With each pulse, they are not warriors, he clicked to his surviving soldiers. They are something else entirely. Commander Varek, his armor breached in 14 places and his body running on combat stems in sheer determination, stood in the shadow of humanity's greatest gamble, and realized they had won something more significant than a battle. They had proven that consciousness itself, messy, contradictory, beautifully imperfect consciousness, was the universe's answer to every form of tyranny. The tower's hum became a roar that resonated across dimensional barriers. Through the gateway, Elena could sense the architect's ancient satisfaction as it prepared to unveil the final phase of humanity's initiation into cosmic consciousness. Phase 5 commencing, she announced, her voice now carrying harmonics from spaces that existed before the Big Bang. Prepare for transcendence. The real transformation was about to begin. The silence that followed was more profound than the absence of sound. It was the pause between one universe and the next. Commander Varek stood in the crater where Zirian Prime's desert had been, looking up at a sky that no longer followed the rules of conventional physics. The tower had become something beyond architecture, a living equation that solved itself by existing. A bridge between what was and what could be. Above them, the combined fleets of the triumvirate hung motionless in space, their weapons systems powered down not from defeat, but from a kind of cosmic awe that transcended species barriers. The consciousness-based entities that had emerged from the dimensional gateway weren't conquerors or destroyers, they were teachers, showing 3 civilizations that had grown rigid in their certainty that there were other ways to exist. Dr. Elena Voss materialized beside Varek, her form flickering between human and something far more complex. The transformation was complete. Now she existed simultaneously in 11 dimensions, her consciousness a living bridge between baseline humanity and cosmic awareness. The architect has finished its assessment, she said, her voice carrying harmonics that made the air itself sing. Humanity has passed the test. What test? Varek asked, though part of him already understood. The test of whether a species can grow beyond its limitations without losing what makes it unique. Elena's smile was recognizably human despite the fractal patterns of light that now composed her features. The Vrexheim mastered brutality but forgot mercy. The Kethmori achieved perfection but lost creativity. The Zypherians created beauty but eliminated discord. Each species optimized itself into stagnation around them. The surviving human soldiers were picking themselves up from the battlefield. Sergeant Steelwind, his armor held together with salvaged alien components and human ingenuity, helped Lieutenant Blackthorn to her feet. Both of them bore scars that would never fully heal. Neural pathways burned out by interfacing with consciousness-based entities, cellular damage from reality warping weapons, psychological trauma from deliberately embracing chaos as a weapon. But they were still recognizably, stubbornly, magnificently human. And us? Varek asked. You adapted, Elena replied. When faced with superior technology, you became more creative. When confronted with mathematical perfection, you embraced beautiful randomness. When challenged by aesthetic tyranny, you weaponized ugliness itself. You never stopped being human. You just became more human than anyone thought possible. The communication array crackled to life. Admiral Krixnos of the Vrexheim Third Fleet, his voice carrying a new note of something that might have been respect, opened a channel to the surface. Commander Varek, the translation matrix rendered his clicking speech. The Triumvirate Council has reached a consensus. We formally request humanity's admission to galactic civilization as an equal partner. Supreme Calculator Vexani's mathematical perfection had been permanently altered by exposure to true randomness. Her next transmission carried probability matrices that no Kethmori had ever conceived. The mathematical models indicate that galactic civilization requires unpredictable variables to achieve optimal development. Humanity represents the chaos factor necessary for continued evolution. Fleet singer Melodic Vortex had composed an entirely new art form during the Battle of Symphony that incorporated discord as a fundamental element, creating beauty through imperfection. The humans have taught us new forms of expression. Their admission to the galactic community will create artistic possibilities we never imagined. But the real victory wasn't political or military, it was philosophical. The tower pulsed one final time, and suddenly every sentient being within 100 light-years felt a shift in consciousness. The rigid barriers between species, the assumptions about limitation and possibility, the fear of change that had kept galactic civilization stagnant for millennia. All of it cracked open like an egg, revealing something new underneath. General, th. His carapace scarred from human weapons, but his compound eyes bright with newfound understanding, approached the human command position under a banner of truce. Your species fights unlike any other, he clicked. You treat defeat as a tactical advantage, pain as a weapon, and impossible odds as an invitation to creativity. I would learn from you. Elena felt the architect's ancient presence beginning to withdraw, its cosmic experiment complete. The entity had waited eons for a species that could bridge the gap between order and chaos, logic and intuition, individual consciousness and cosmic awareness. Humanity had proven that intelligence wasn't about optimization, it was about adaptation. The gateway will remain open, Elena explained as she began to solidify back into purely human form. The cosmic consciousness settling into patterns her baseline species could comprehend, not just as a doorway, but as a reminder. The universe is vast and strange and full of possibilities that no single species can imagine alone. Commander Varric looked around at the transformed battlefield. The desert of Zirian Prime had become something else, not destroyed, but evolved. Where human soldiers had fallen, crystalline structures grew that hummed with the frequency of consciousness itself. Where alien weapons had struck, gardens of impossible beauty bloomed with flowers that existed in 17 dimensions. Simultaneously, Sir, Lieutenant Blackthorn reported, her scarred face showing the first genuine happiness she'd felt in months. We're receiving diplomatic overtures from 4 to 7 different species. Apparently, news of the battle has spread throughout the galaxy. Everyone wants to establish contact with the species that weaponized creativity. Sergeant Steelwind, leaning heavily on a rifle that was now part human technology and part crystallized mathematics, grinned through his battle damage. Does this mean we don't have to be quarantined anymore? Varric smiled, feeling the weight of humanity's future settling onto his shoulders. It was a burden he was proud to carry. No, Sergeant, we're not quarantined anymore. We're invited. As the twin suns of Zirian Prime sat behind the impossible tower, painting the sky in colors that human eyes had never seen before. The first chapter of humanity's galactic story came to an end, but Elena, her consciousness still partially distributed across 11 dimensions, could see the threads of probability that stretched out from this moment. There would be other challenges, other tests, other species that needed to learn the lessons humanity had taught through blood and stubbornness and magnificent, terrible creativity. The universe was vast and full of civilizations that had forgotten how to grow, how to change, how to become something more than what they were, but now they had teachers. The humans had laughed at the galaxy's limitations and rewritten the sky itself, and in doing so, they had opened a door that could never be closed, a path from what was to what could be, paved with the beautiful, chaotic, eternally surprising nature of human consciousness. The real adventure was just beginning.